Hello, folks, and welcome to the W Club Decanted podcast. Luke Crowley Holland here, and on this episode, I'm joined by Lee Kennedy, founder and Master Distiller at the Leiper's Fork Distillery, Tennessee. The Leiper's Fork Bourbon is the 2024 W Club Whisky of the Year as selected by our W Club Premium members. It was really great to sit down with Lee and discuss all things Leiper's Fork and American whiskey more broadly. W Club Premium members can enjoy 10% off Leiper's Fork Bourbon and all our other category winners in-store and online between now and September 2025. Enjoy the show. Brilliant. So Lee, thank you for joining us. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on and make the effort. I know you're a busy man, so thank you.
Absolutely, Luke. Honored to be here and glad to be able to be on with you. And it was fun being on the Drams digital Drams tasting event a couple of weeks ago. So thanks for the continued support. Glad to be here.
No, that's a privilege. You've queued up perfectly the segue, the natural opening segue there, which is for some of the listeners might not know, but you were on the digital Drams with us, but end of January, which was to celebrate the W Club Members' Choice Awards. Your win of Whisky of the Year. So just for context for those who might not know. For the last 2 years, we started this W Club Members' Choice Awards where we get brands to send in whiskies. We decant them into nondescript bottles with no name, no nothing on them, and then conduct blind tastings all over the UK with our W Club Premium members, who then kind of score them out of 100. They're categorized by their kind of mash bill or their style, like single malt, blended malt. You were in the Leiper's bourbon was in the alternative mash bill, which in theory could have a grain whiskey in it, a pot still. It was kind of the others, which we might grow them into individual categories when we get more entries as the award grows. But for now, it's the alternative mash bill category. And you were the I hope you don't mind me saying, I said it on the night of the digital Drams, the surprise winner. We were excited to have you enter, and you won the not only your own category but the overall Whisky of the Year. So it was brilliant, brilliant victory.
Well, yeah, obviously we were surprised as well, Luke. Our distributor over the UK is Paul Roget, and so Tim Webster, our main rep there, reached out to us and let us know that we had won that award, and it took us back a little bit too. And to be honest with you, that was one of the highlights for our 2024 was winning that, and so thank you for including us, and thank you to the consumers of the Whiskey Club for selecting us. So yeah, it was a surprise to us as well to win a whiskey award, Whisky of the Year in the home of whiskey, being the UK. So that was it was a great honor for us. So thank you for having us on. Absolutely.
Yeah, brilliant. And in that aforementioned digital Drams, we had there was some great whiskies, yourself in there, like the Bushmills 21 was one of the category winners. There was some great ones from Loch Lomond Distillery. So yeah, there was some, it was good company you were in.
Well, exactly. And, we're a new distillery as far as distilleries go. We've only been operating, it'll be 9 years this coming April. And so to be included in the conversation with some historic brands like Bushmills and Glen Scotia and Loch Lomond and Black Label and the rest of it, or Black Bottle and the rest of it, it was. I felt I had a little bit of imposter syndrome, to be honest with you. But it was really fun. Of course, I really love blind taste tests. I think they take away, they strip away the marketing and some of the preconceived notions about whiskey. So I'm a big proponent of blind taste tests. You're just getting liquid to lips with no context, and I think when you do that, it's a good opportunity to learn a lot about yourself as a consumer, and to be able to I don't even use judge, but taste a spirit with none of those preconceived notions, so to speak.
Yeah, no.
Job well done.
Definitely. I mean that's it's a fun award. As I said, this is the second year running. Hopefully we'll keep going, keep growing. So it's great, and we're hoping to get your entry in for next year as well. You've kind of teed me up again there with you said you're a new distillery. So you opened in 2016, I believe.
Yeah, opened in 2016. The project really it goes back to when I was a teenager, to be honest with you. The project was almost 20 years in the making. In a roundabout way, but actually started putting pen to paper for the distillery in around 2008, 2009. We could get into some of the history later, but yeah, so I approached my county of Williamson County here in Tennessee. We're located about 45 minutes south of Nashville, and in the rolling hills of Middle Tennessee. And so our county actually had a law against distilling, which American Prohibition was pretty wild, as you all know, and we can get into some of that later too. But they actually had a law in their books that prevented distilling in the county. And so when I approached them in 2012, they said, "We're not opposed to you doing this. We just don't have a law to allow you to operate within the county." So it took us 3 years to change the law here in our county, 4 public hearings, all the rest of it. And so we got our building permits in January of 2015, and started distilling in April of 2016.
Interesting, because I was reading previously that there was a statewide law change around distillation in 2009 that had a big impact on kind of Tennessee whiskey. But obviously that wasn't enough. You still had issues at the county level to get your project off the ground.
Yeah, so when they changed the law, and we can speak to some of the history now if you want to.
Yeah, well, I mean, I
Or I
would
could.
be really keen to jump into that. Actually, before we do, because I think that could be a bigger, maybe not bigger is not the right word, but a longer conversation. But in this time period, in terms of your own background,
Yeah.
what were you doing yourself as an income, or what did you study at university, or?
Yeah, absolutely. So I my fascination with distilling actually started when I was a 16, 17-year-old kid. And I was always a weird kid with a very inquisitive mind, and always been kind of history focused. I got a minor at university in history. And so it always fascinated me from an early age, or from a teenage age, that my family, we talked about the origins of my family are Scots Irish, and they came over from Northern Ireland by way of Lower Scotland, Ayrshire. And so it always kind of captured my imagination, the fact that these early settlers into the New World, being Scots Irish, came over and started distilling with different grains that they had. They didn't have barley, of course we do now, but they discovered Native American maize, and started distilling in the New World. So that initially captured my imagination. So as a 17-year-old kid, I actually built a little still in my mom's basement out of a 5-gallon pressure cooker with some from Sears, and some copper condensing line from Home Depot. You probably don't have Home Depot over here, but over there. But
We know the
and
concept from
yeah,
television.
absolutely. And a 5-gallon bucket was my condenser, filled with ice water. So that was kind of my first. And at that time, that was in the mid '90s, and so we didn't have YouTube back then. There wasn't the internet. Now you can learn how to make an atom bomb on the internet, on YouTube. And so back then, you either had to know somebody who dabbled in it, or find some kind of old archaic literature. And so I kind of had both of those things at my disposal. I had an uncle who dabbled in making a little whiskey at home, and also had access to a series of books called the Foxfire books, and they were written by an Appalachian state professor, and he cataloged the Appalachian people know-how. And in one of the chapters in the first volume or first series of that book is called "Moonshining as a Fine Art," and so I was able to glean enough information between my uncle and that book to figure out how to distill some very crude whiskey. I didn't kill anybody or blow anything up, and I wasn't distilling back then because I was trying to create my own alcohol for consuming. It was just a fascination with the process.
Mhm.
And so that was kind of my first, kind of foray into what would become the passion for distilling. Went to university at Auburn University down in Alabama for forestry. Ended up graduating in business administration, and I took that little still with me. Didn't distill there, but I gave speeches on the topic. When I had to do some kind of business speech class or a how-to speech. Came back to Nashville, and actually got into financial services. And so I had a small RIA shop doing retail investment for folks, and putting together financial plans. But at that time, I had kind of the mental capacity to wrap my head around what we call the backwoods chemistry of distilling, and started. And so I was able to. At that time, there was more literature written on the subject. So I devoured everything I could on the subject, and distilling at home became a major passion of mine. And so I did that behind the, kind of behind the scenes until the law changed in 2009. So, I didn't, when we started the distillery, we didn't have a distiller come in and kind of take the reins and do everything for us at the distillery because of my background. And to be honest too, while we were building the distillery and getting everything approved, I was spending a lot of time in Kentucky with some folks up there. I tell people the science behind making whiskey, whether that's on a 1 gallon pot or a 1,000 gallon pot, the chemistry is the same. So a lot of that was kind of perfecting my craft and my knowledge, and also learning how to run professional equipment, which in all honesty is a lot easier, to be honest with you. But so yeah, that's kind of my background. I've kind of bootstrapped everything, I think because of the way we started the distillery, just from my passion for distilling and just a true love of, I consider whiskey and all its, whatever whiskey it is, to be a consumable art form. I really do. And so I took that kind of viewpoint into the way we started and created our distillery and the way we create whiskey. So, kind of organically, the distillery happened. Just it grew out of my own passion, and so anyway, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's really fascinating and really interesting. There's a lot actually that I love to kind of dig into there. It's interesting. You were saying I studied history for my undergraduate as well, and you're right. The what you were saying about the settlers coming over and using the corn that was there, because that's what really the earliest whiskey we know about distillation. It was grain preservation. This is what people made alcohol
Yeah.
for. It was to preserve these resources that were around them and turn them into something else that would last longer. And then also in terms of people in your family having being distilling, that's another old tradition. People, they famously say, obviously the monasteries in Ireland and Scotland were the kind of the first home of distillation, and that dissipated into the public. And people say when the British government started taxing and requiring licensing of whiskies, which is kind of what creates the kind of what we would call poitín in Ireland, what you would call moonshine, that you don't, you can regulate these big distilleries out of existence, but you can't the knowledge just dissipates into the population. It's still getting passed around, because you can't get people to unlearn how to distill.
Absolutely. And it was, and kind of dovetailing into that, that fascinated me how that know-how kind of got woven into the cultural fabric of Scotland and Ireland. Those Irish and Scottish monks took the technology, as from the Moors, and who a lot of times were distilling. And of course, that's the way.
This was the other thing I was going to say. And you said you were distilling as a teenager, not necessarily for consumption. The Moors were distilling for medicinal perfume,
yes,
for other reasons. They weren't necessarily drinking it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I say. They're distilling perfumes and such. And so, the Irish and Scottish took the contraption known as a still back to Scotland and Ireland and made whiskey and changed the world. So, and that interested me too. It's like the first reference to what would become bourbon in the New World was in the 1620s by a man named George Thorpe in Virginia. And so he wrote back to a colleague in the UK saying that he had made a distilled a fine brandy out of Native American maize. And so that was and that was in the 1620s. So people were starting to distill distill corn-based distillates in this almost from the time English, Scottish, and Irish colonies started.
That's very early doors, because you're talking about what, like 1590s, when the first kind of colony set up, or around that period?
I think Jamestown is like 1604, something early 1600s,
so
late
right
1500s.
out the gate.
Yeah, so it was here early, and so it all has its roots back to Scotland and Ireland. So I always say, if you're, no matter where you're making whiskey in the world, whether it's the U.S., Japan, wherever, India, you've got to pay homage back to Scotland and Ireland, because that's where it came from, and so we try to tap into that heritage as well. And of course, we have a rich heritage here in Tennessee as well, and we've had a very interesting relationship with whiskey in the state of Tennessee, even though we're known as one of the kind of, and I may have said this on the Digital Drams podcast, but up until 20 years ago, when you thought about whiskey, you thought about Scotland, Ireland, Kentucky, and Tennessee. And Tennessee's had a weird relationship with distilling whiskey, even though it's been known as one of the four main whiskey making regions of the world. So it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, well, I love on the website, which I having like spoke to you before this, and seen other kind of print and audio interviews you've done. There was a term, just with a quick side note in terms of what you were discussing in terms of distillation and moonshine. You were calling it hillbilly chemistry on another podcast. So I think it was a great
Yeah,
turn of
very
phrase.
true. Yeah,
But
very
I
true.
like the way on your website place your story within the wider context, the wider timeline of American distillation, or at least Kentucky, Tennessee distillation, which some brands do, maybe because they're trying to create a backstory for themselves. But speaking with you, it seems like a genuine, you genuinely see yourself in that kind of tradition and pantheon, which I absolutely love.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm proud of that heritage of American distillers, and I've always thought, and you heard people say that whiskey is history in a glass. You can tell a lot of the history of Scotland and Ireland through whiskey, and the same you could do the same thing with bourbon and Tennessee whiskey as well. So, I look at Tennessee, going back to that weird relationship. In 1896. Tennessee became a state in 1796, and in 1896, for our 100-year centennial, they did an industrial census of the state, and we had 322 distilleries in the state of Tennessee at that time, and so it was the largest manufacturing industry in the state at the time, and Kentucky at that point had around 350 distilleries. So the size and scope of the whiskey industry in Kentucky and Tennessee were virtually the same. And so you fast forward a little bit to 1910, or actually, 1910. So prohibition movements had started gaining ground in Tennessee a lot earlier and a lot more with a lot more strength than places like Kentucky and the rest of the country. So, Tennessee actually enacted its own in-state prohibition in 1910. The U.S. federal prohibition came in 1920. So, if you look at the headline from the Tennessean newspaper in December 31st, 1909, it reads, "All distilleries and breweries must shut down at midnight tonight." And at that time, there were about 41 distilleries listed in the state. So virtually within a 10-year time frame, a little over the 10-year time frame, we went from 322 distilleries in the state to 40. So a lot of those guys and girls saw the handwriting on the wall and went to places like Kentucky and set up shop. And so when we enacted prohibition in 1910, that carried on until federal prohibition ended in 1933. Tennessee kept it going to 1937. So we had an extra 14 years of prohibition. And going back to what you were talking about with the excise laws in Scotland and how couldn't stop moonshiners, the same thing happened in Tennessee. So all those people working in distilleries in Tennessee, when they shut those down, a lot of those people didn't go work in flower shops on the corner. They went to the hills and hollows and started making illegal whiskey. And so and we actually had a lot of the crime syndicates from Chicago, Philadelphia, Cleveland. They were coming to Tennessee to buy legal whiskey during the prohibition and taking them back to those urban centers because we had kind of perfected the illegal whiskey trade here in Tennessee because we had a 10-year head start on on the rest of the country. So, and I actually had an interesting side note on that and my third great uncle was a revenuer in Williamson County during Prohibition. And in 1925, between January and March, he busted 73 illegal stills just in his county. And on March the 7th of 1925, he was murdered by what was called the Williamson County Whiskey Ring. So he was bad for business. And it's actually a pretty well known story in our county. And so it's just kind of ironic that he was on the revenuing side of the business and I'm
You're on the
distilling
other
now.
side.
Of course,
Yeah.
he was a lawman, but and so we're doing everything legal. So I think he would be okay with that. But just kind of an interesting deal. So a
Brilliant.
little,
And
go ahead,
no, no,
Mark.
no. Well, I was just going to say because is there still dry counties within Tennessee?
Yeah, not many. So, we've got what they call, damp counties, but there are still a handful of dry counties left. So there was a lot of state what we called county line package stores or liquor stores opened up all over the place. And so I actually grew up in a dry county, and it was interesting because county line package stores really thrived, and it was a big industry. But yeah, we still have a little bit of that. Matter of fact, our big brother down the road in Lynchburg, they distill in a dry county. They're not allowed to sell bottles within that county, and they don't. And they don't want to change that because they think it's wildly hilarious that they're the largest distiller in a dry county. But
Yeah,
so a lot of
they make more money using that as a marketing technique than ever would selling it within that own county to
absolutely. And so Tennessee, actually, when Prohibition ended in 1937 in Tennessee, they allowed each county to, and we could get into the history of Prohibition if you want to, but I don't know how much time we have. But when 1937 came and Tennessee finally repealed Prohibition in state, they allowed each county to vote on whether they wanted distilleries back in the county. And at that time, we've got 95 counties in Tennessee. Only 3 counties decided to elect to have distilleries back in the county. And so that just so happens where Jack Daniels and George Dickel sits. And the rest of the 92 counties, no, yeah, 92 counties were essentially locked down until 2009. So in 2009, our state legislature finally was approached by people like myself who were looking to create distilleries in their own county. And our state legislature finally reversed that law after essentially 100 years of an outlaw of manufacturing in a lot of counties. And so their thought process was, if a county allowed liquor by the drink. So if I could walk in, and your UK folks are going to understand this, but if I could walk into a restaurant in, say, Dixon County, Tennessee, and buy a Maker's Mark neat, why can't I distill that Maker's Mark in the county? And so that was one of the reasons. So the law stipulates that any county that serves liquor by the glass, it reserves the right to open distilleries within that county. And so our county of Williamson obviously has that. So yeah.
No, that's fascinating, and like yeah, I mean we could even either double back or dive into the kind of history of prohibition. I know it played a big story in Irish whiskey, not just your own prohibition in the sense of the loss of America as a market for Irish whiskey, but there was a huge temperance movement in Ireland in that time period in the kind of 1890s. The kind of Father Matthew. Was people who know Irish history will know him, a very famous kind of priest who was a leader of the kind of temperance movement of the age. So it was very much of its time, and it's as someone who works in the alcohol industry, and obviously I'm not in favor of prohibition, but you can some of the arguments you can actually see why it was such a popular movement, like in terms of the good and the bad that came from that period. Like it wasn't. It was very much it had, I don't know if it had popular support, but there was a plurality of Americans who were behind it. It wasn't sort of a blindsided decision in 1919 when the Volstead Act came in that just imposed this down on the public. Like
That's very true. And so that we kind of in the US, we kind of had a perfect storm of conditions that allowed prohibition to happen. So there were growing prohibition movements before the American Civil War. After the American Civil War, we had a lot of wounded people in this country, both mentally and physically, and a lot of those people turned to alcohol as a salve, for their daily problems. And so really, the emotional driver behind American prohibition was the Women's Christian Temperance Union or temperance movement, and so that was kind of the emotional play, and then the real teeth behind American prohibition was the Anti-Saloon League. So during the early 1900s, late 1800s, the saloon, probably the same way as the pubs in the UK, it's like the poor man's country club. So that's where you went to get the, to find local job offerings, the news of the day, to network and all those different things. Well, men were spending more time in the saloons than they were at home. And so there became a political movement called the Anti-Saloon League that was really the teeth. And so the Anti-Saloon League was very strong in Tennessee, not as strong in Kentucky. And so that's why we had such it became a political movement in Tennessee more than anything. But the conditions were right for it, and obviously it was a massive failure. I think consumption actually went up during American Prohibition,
Yeah.
which was wild. Obviously a lot of people died from some really bad whiskey and gin and all the rest of it. So it was Ken Burns, who's a famous American
Yeah.
documentary filmmaker. He did a great series on the American Prohibition. That's pretty fascinating. But Irish were sending whiskey over that was coming in through Boston, and the Canadians were sending whiskey down through our northern border, and rum was coming in through Florida and in the southeast coast. So it didn't shut it off. It just people just
No, yeah,
got a lot.
yeah, it fed organized crime, and as you say, it
Yeah,
lowered the quality of drinking, and it killed off what was an amazing cocktail culture within America. I mean, but a lot of the kind of cocktail scene of the last maybe 15 years has been about trying to bring back those pre-prohibition cocktails, and the
sure.
kind of the daisy and a lot of these sort of drinks that had vanished with prohibition, or at least gone out of popularity. So
Absolutely.
yeah,
And,
no, it
and
is.
really,
And
go ahead.
sorry, go on. Yeah.
I was going to say, American Prohibition, it affected our alcohol industry landscape so much. We're actually still dealing with the effects of it today. Like you're talking about Tennessee just reversing that law in 2009. Before American Prohibition, the American alcohol industry landscape looked more akin to the UK or Europe, where you had local breweries, local distilleries making their local beer and whiskeys, and local consumers. And then so when that prohibition came, it eliminated the entire industry and created a blank slate. So I don't think we would have seen the quick corporatization of the American alcohol industry as we would have without prohibition.
Yeah.
So it's pretty fascinating. And one little thing too, like being kind of proud of Kentucky and Tennessee, like if you look at the historical context of like why is Kentucky and Tennessee known for whiskey production and not Ohio and areas like that, or in New England. And so a lot of those folks coming to the New World or to America from Scotland and Ireland, they didn't want to go to New England. Obviously they were trying to escape a lot of that. So they ended up kind of migrating and coming over and hitting ports south and coming into Virginia and North Carolina and going over the Appalachian Mountains to where they were kind of free to do what they want without the English on their back, so to speak. But
Yeah.
yeah, so that's kind of just a weird
Yeah, I mean
story.
that's maybe a conversation for a different podcast, but there is that fascinating the way the Germans tended to talk about what's now the Midwest, or that kind of those northern states, and yeah, as you say, the kind of Scots sort of Protestant communities who went to the Appalachians and down through. It's fascinating the different sort of waves of migration and different migration patterns are kind of a fascinating part of what shapes modern America. And what the drinks you're talking about, you talk about that those laws having an impact today. You spoke very eloquently on our tasting, our digital drams tasting about the kind of Bottle and Bond Act as a consumer protection law. In terms of those, the impact it had, the prohibition had, from that law being introduced, which is quite in the early days of America, to what we have now today in terms of the virgin casks, for production of bourbon, and the very strict mash bill. Could you maybe kind of give us an overview of that process, and how prohibition impacts what we, speaking of yours, I have your Leiper's bourbon here in front of me, the award-winning whiskey. Why it's called a bourbon? What makes it a bourbon from that side of view, from that point of view? Sorry.
Sure. Well, the federal regulations for the production of bourbon are, and I'm sure a lot of your consumers know this, obviously bourbon is America's official native spirit. You can make it in all 50 states. A lot of people from Kentucky will argue that point with me, and not as much anymore, but I actually did when we first started the distillery. People from Kentucky would argue that point with me, and I would have to go to the the official description from the federal government of bourbon, and nowhere does it list Kentucky. So bourbon is America's official native spirit. Corn is America's official native grain, and so because of that, bourbon has to be made with at least 51% corn. The rest of your grain bill could be whatever grains the distiller decides to be, but it has to be at least 51% corn. It has to be distilled to a proof no higher than 80%, so 160 proof, and that's for flavor. We know that, the lower your distillation proof off the still, the more flavor in that distillate. So that's a way of controlling flavor and the consistency of the category. It has to be aged in, and actually the law states new oak container. It doesn't say barrel. It doesn't say anything about charring. It's just new oak container. It doesn't stipulate American oak, French oak, European oak, whatever. And then there's actually no age statement. So if it's under 4 years of age, you have to have an age statement on the bottle. If it's over 4 years of age, you do not. So if you put that whiskey in a barrel for 1 minute, you have to put aged for 1 minute on the bottle, and then bottled at 80 proof or 40% or higher. So that's the definition of bourbon, and Tennessee whiskey meets all those requirements as well. So obviously within that, there's a lot of ways that distillers can affect flavors and the way that you approach production. But that's the framework that all American distilleries are having to operate under. I would say that probably the biggest component of, for American whiskeys, the barrel makes up about 65% of the flavor profile because of the requirement for new cask. And so that a lot of times creates a situation where a lot of American whiskeys can taste the same to a lot of people. Obviously, if you're familiar and intimate with American whiskeys, you can figure out the nuances and the difference in the profiles of each whiskey. But because of that newness of the cask, American whiskeys tend to be barrel forward because of that. And there's some rumblings that could change, but we're not hearing anything that's going to happen anytime soon.
I don't think you'd almost want it to change. I think it's part of the charm of.
Yeah.
It's like I had an old boss, a great man, who used to always say, drink some sherry because you're feeding the Scottish sherry industry. It's not quite true, but I like the sentiment, and I like, every time I drink a bourbon, I'm keeping a cooper in a job. Or,
Well, that's true, and sustainability is, and it should be a big issue globally, and so with the consumption of white oak trees for American casks, that's an issue. But like when we dump a barrel, if it's not picked up by a local brewery or a winery or somebody doing something else with the barrel, we sell that barrel to a broker who's sending it back to Scotland and Ireland to be reused. So it's not getting used one time and thrown away. It's absolutely. So it's,
no, I mean,
the life of that barrel is continuing to serve a purpose.
yeah, the sustainability issue is a fair point, but they do go through a huge life after. A Scotch or Irish whiskey will be aged in it, or as you say, a wine or a beer, and they don't. It's not like a one and done. It's
No,
not like it's in plastic straw or something. So yeah,
sure.
it's a different, and it's the shape of these things hasn't changed in 3,000 years. It is going back to the history bit. It's really like touching that the past.
Oh, I love it. I think I love visiting cooperages because it's just fascinating, because it's still most of those barrels are still hand raised. There's a guy or a gal that's actually putting that barrel together, which is an art form in itself, and obviously no nails in it, and all the rest. And it's also fascinating to me that you can take whiskey off the same run, fill two barrels off the same run, and they end up completely different
Yeah.
after their maturation time. So it's great, and the reason we use American white oak, and I'm not sure if you know this, American white oak is our most abundant hardwood tree in the U.S., especially where we are, and it has the tightest wood grain of any American hardwood, and so that tightness of wood grain obviously promotes holding liquid very well, and then also the density of that wood grain makes that where it has a higher wood sugar count. So when the barrel's being charred inside, that denseness of the grain of that hardwood is providing more caramelized sugars for developing the profile of the whiskey during maturation.
Yeah, you can tell that Quirk Casalba a mile away, you know.
No, absolutely.
It is good. It's part of that history and story. So, in terms of your own distillation process, because you mentioned there about people maybe find it difficult to differentiate between bourbons if they're not used to them because of that kind of wood forward note. I find one of the you know, like when I was first getting into whiskey, I could certainly empathize with that position. What sort of jumped out for me initially was, you know, you try a wheat whiskey or you try something else that's you know, where the might be virgin oak, but the mash bill is incredibly different, and you then suddenly start getting these really spicy notes, these extra different notes, and then that was kind of the way in. And then now I think, you know, I'm much more, maybe it's just because I drink too much, but I'm much more adept at picking out some of the nuances within the bourbon. And obviously, you know, this has won the award, so it's a tremendous bourbon. So maybe you don't just do the bourbon here, you do other styles of whiskey as well. You do a Tennessee whiskey, I know. Could you maybe tell us about the different styles you have and maybe your distillation technique as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like we were saying, we're family owned. We're a small producer. We only make about 500 casks per year. We'll scale that up pretty soon, but that's what actually when I was creating when we had the law change, they actually capped me at 25,000 gallons of production per year, and so that translates to about 500 barrels per year. We're actually in the process of probably going to revisit that, but yeah. So we make Tennessee whiskey and bourbon and rye whiskey. We're a whiskey house. I tell people, in keeping with the traditions of Tennessee, we don't make a vodka or a gin, so we're only producing whiskey. And we can get into the bottle and bond a little bit, but we the rye whiskey we make, we're actually finishing up our rye run right now. So the first of the year, we make a little bit of rye, only about 50 barrels per year, 50 to 100. And then the rest of that time, we're making Tennessee whiskey and bourbon. So we're about to go to our bourbon until July. And then in July, we'll go to our Tennessee whiskey production. And that's to meet the requirements of the bottle and bond aspect. But yeah, so completely, we touch every aspect of the process. I do use the term, it sounds kind of enigmatic, that we're making pre-prohibition styles of whiskey, and we can get into that. I'll describe that as we go, but all of our grains that we're using come from within a 10-mile radius of the distillery. We actually grow about 50% of our own corn, and so that's non-GMO, heirloom grains. And we're trying to create as much of a terroir whiskey as we can. That's hard with cooperage being such an affector of flavor when it comes to American whiskey. But as far as our base distillate, we're trying to have it as an expression of our surroundings. So we're very focused on hyper local. One thing we're doing as well is as for our barley malt, and I touched on this a little bit for the digital drams, but we actually use a toasted barley malt. So a lot of American distillers, they view their malt as an enzyme grain. They're trying to get those amylase enzymes out of that grain to convert starch to sugar. And so we actually treat our barley malt as a flavoring grain, and we use 15%. Most distillers, you need about 5 to 8% barley malt or some kind of malt to be able to convert starch to sugar. And so we use 15% because I love the profile that malt contributes to whiskey, and I love the history and the process behind malt. So we use a toasted malt, so we pay a little bit more for that than a normal distiller's malt. And so after that two-step drying process that malt naturally goes through, it goes into a kiln, and then it's toasted for a specific amount of time. So it's almost like a Vienna style malt. And so it's adding a depth of character to that whiskey that we have been able to identify in the whiskey. So that's a little bit different than what as far as our production, focusing on quality ingredients going in. I touched on this as well. We use a sweet mash process in our whiskeys instead of a sour mash process. So, just to not get on a crazy tangent with that, it's creating a higher pH by not adding acidic backset to your mash water when you're starting to mash cook. By starting with a fresh batch of water, is creating a higher pH all the way through the process, and a higher pH lends itself to softness. So if you think of alkalinity, you think of softness. If you think of acidity, you think of sharpness. So we're seeing those higher pHs carry through all the way through maturation. So that's why we use the sweet mash process. It's also, I say at the distillery, we're inefficient by design. So we don't do anything economy of scale. Our hands touch everything. We still use old school hydrometers to proof our whiskey. We're not using an Anton bar, proofing machine. Everything we do is inefficient with attention to details. So that sweet mash process is probably the only efficient thing we do. So, and I won't get into that, but it's a gentler style of cooking. We're not boiling our corn when it goes in. We're not putting that corn in at say 212 degrees Fahrenheit, which would be boiling for you all, and taking it and boiling it. We're actually heating it to about 200 degrees Fahrenheit. All steam goes off, and we start introducing our grain. So sometimes through aggressive boiling, you can degrade some of the starches in the grain. So it's a gentler method. And we feel like producing soft notes in the whiskey. So yeah, that's a little bit different. And there's a handful of distilleries going back to that pre-prohibition style. Sweet mash was more prevalent, not as prevalent as sour mash, but it was more prevalent before prohibition than after prohibition. Just most of the folks that came back were producing sour mash. So it's a little bit of tip of the hat to pre-prohibition. And right now, as I know, there's probably 6 or 7 distilleries in the U.S. doing sweet mash.
I didn't realize it was so limited. I was well aware of sour mash. I know there's a few other brands. I mean, not to name them. I mean, you mentioned makers earlier on, but there's like a Michter's sour mash that I think was quite nice.
Yeah.
And but I didn't realize it made that much of a difference to the flavor. To be honest, showing my ignorance. But no, that's really fascinating. And in terms of your casking ABV, I think I read somewhere, or maybe you mentioned on the digital drams, your casking about 110 proof, was it?
Yeah, we go in at 110 or 55%. So and actually, I skipped one of these regulations on bourbon, and you just reminded me. So going into the barrel, the federal regulation is at 125 proof or less, which is 62.5% or less. And so before American Prohibition, that barrel entry proof limit was 110. So that's one of the reasons, like going back to those pre-prohibition techniques we're using, that's one of the reasons we go in at a lower a lower proof point into the cask. The other reason, which I touched on a little bit in the digital drams segment as well, is Seagram's did a very large study on all aspects of the distilling industry. And one of the studies that they did was the effects of proof point on barrel maturation and how that affected the whiskey. So, they took whiskey at 125 proof, filled multiple barrels, 124 proof, all the way down to 100, put those in barrels and study what was going on molecularly in the barrel. And they found that at 110 proof, you were getting more extraction of caramels and vanillins out of the barrel than any other proof point. So it's a more efficient use of the barrel for extracting flavor, but also, but you're buying more barrels. So it makes us more efficient. If we were putting whiskey in at 125, we would be packing more alcohol into the barrel. So by default, we would be buying less barrels. So us being a small grain to glass producer with, we look at everything, every decision we make at the distillery, as far as our production is what is right for the whiskey. And we feel like a lower barrel entry proof is it's historic, and it's what we feel is the right thing to do for the whiskey.
And it's coming off the stills. Is it coming off the stills at that 160 proof, did you say?
No, so for our distillation proof is 137, which is very specific.
Yeah, so there's not much of a cut then being made at all between still strength and casking strength.
Not much. And so a lot of distilleries will distill to the point where they're coming straight off the still and going into the cask, because I think it's a pretty cool technique. And going back a little bit on our still design, that's another thing that kind of makes us pre-prohibition. So, we use a pot still at the distillery, and I think I talked about this. I originally looked to Forsyth over in Elgin for a still, and they had like almost a 3-year lead time back when we were creating the distillery. And so went to Vendome Copper and Brass in Louisville, Kentucky. They've been building stills there since the 1890s. And so we designed a still that has a lot of the elements of a Scottish swan neck pot still. And so the reason I did that is I love the simplicity of pot distillation. I think it's very simple, and it's also very historic. So Aeneas Coffey, who's an Irishman who invented the column still, in the coffee still in 1850s, he really invented that still for the gin market in London, from what I've read. And so for producers to make an efficient neutral grain spirit almost to satisfy that. And so uh, for a long time, so American distillers adopted column distillation for whiskey, and that's predominantly what's used now. So us using a pot still is a nod kind of to history and to traditional techniques and a lot of pre-prohibition. There were more people using pot stills before prohibition than there are now, especially with a lot of large legacy brands. But also that's a little bit. I don't want to say it's a detriment to us, but and I'll talk a little bit about the British consumer or the UK consumer, but Americans have gotten used to column distilled whiskeys, and so a lot of people, pot distilled whiskeys tend to be more robust. They have a heavier mouthfeel, and so and I like that about pot distilled whiskeys. They have a lot of robust flavor in them, but the American palate really has been shaped by column distilled whiskeys. And so what I love about the British consumers, they don't have as many their palate is not ingrained for bourbon or American whiskeys like it would be in the States. So they're open to trying a Leiper's Fork Distillery or Leiper's Fork bourbon and saying, oh, that's different than the traditional American whiskeys or bourbons that I've tried, but not in a bad way, if that makes sense. And so, to me, if pot distillation is good enough for single malt Scotch, it ought to be good enough for me. So that's one of the reasons we do it too.
Yeah, no, no, definitely. I mean, it's yeah, it's hotly debated within Irish and Scottish whiskey distillation. The kind of the single or the column distillation, the continuous still, in terms of people who embrace it, people who are still quite snobbish about it. But the reality is, it makes up like 90% of all Scottish and Irish whiskey. involves at least some aspect of it. So
Absolutely.
there's that side of things. No, it's really interesting. And that still you had commissioned. Is that what's on the label?
Yeah, that's actually that's the shop drawing of our still, and we say that we put our still front and center on our label because we tell people, and it sounds like kind of marketing bull crap, but we're distillers before first and foremost. We're distillers before anything, actually before we're a brand. So
Hmm.
everything we do revolves around the still. So that's why we put that front and center.
Marvelous. And in terms of your location, Leiper's Fork, I presume, is the name of the farm you're based on, or area you're based in. Could you tell us a bit about the actual environment you're in?
Yeah, so we sit, like I said, we're about 40 minutes south of Nashville. If your listeners are ever in the Nashville area, please come down and see us. But we're surrounded by rolling hills and horse farms and things like that. Very agrarian kind of a culture there. Leiper's Fork is a little hamlet inside Williamson County. Our county seat is called Franklin, so our address says Franklin, but the little hamlet we're in is called Leiper's Fork. My family on my mom's side, which is the Locke family, they've been there since 1805, which is, as far as Tennessee history, is quite a time ago. So when I was creating the distillery, I bought that property when I was in my early 20s with the thought. We sit on 30 acres at the distillery, and so with the thought process of eventually building a home there, and because my family's from that area, and so subsequently, my wife and I found the farm that we live on about 4 miles from the distillery. So I actually tried to sell the piece of property, back in the early 2000s, and never got a bite on it. But so when I started the distillery, I wanted to make whiskey in a rural setting where it was traditionally done, and
Mm.
not in an industrial setting, next to a guy making plastics or something like that. So I feel like we've created a really cool little scene there at the distillery. We have an old cabin from the 1820s. It's our retail and tasting room with some offices, and our still house is a 5,000 square foot mortise and tenon building, which is all pegged together, and it's houses our still and the rest of it. We'll build our rick house in 2020 this year. We're actually designing it right now, so looking forward to doing that. But yeah, it's a very welcoming community. We have a lot of musicians around us naturally, but it used to be a pretty rough place. Our side of the county was known for a lot of illegal whiskey production, until recently, and it's become gentrified a little bit. but yeah, so it's a special place. So.
Yeah, no, Marvis, I know I did say farm in the question, but I looked up in my research for this the pictures of the little hamlet or town, and it does look kind of Main Street USA picture perfect. It's kind of these kind of square corner buildings, and it looks nice. At least when you Google it. I don't know, maybe
Yeah,
it's different when you get there,
it
but
is nice. It's nice. Yeah.
yeah, no, brilliant. No, that's really excellent. I don't know if there's anything particular else that you wanted to cover in terms of the brand lead. It's been a really fascinating conversation. I have the three special questions for you, but I just wanted to see if there's anything you wanted to touch on before we jump into them.
No, not really. It's we're excited to be in the UK market. We've been there for I think it'll be 3 years this year, and we kind of found ourselves there accidentally in a lot of ways. But it's been a fun market to go over and work. So my wife and I go over for about 2 weeks of the year, and we're traveling around Scotland and the UK, down into England and London, obviously. And so it's been fun being over there and meeting with British consumers and all the rest of it. So it's really been, yeah, it's been a really great experience.
No, brilliant. Next time you're over, you must let me know, and we'll grab a drink
Absolutely.
together. That'd be great. So the three questions I teed you up with this, but only earlier on today. I didn't, so you didn't have massive notice. But we ask every guest these. So first off, if you're actually the one that's not on this list that I should have teed you up. So this is a fourth bonus question for the listeners. Perfect serve of Leiper's fork, in terms of either cocktail neat or and additionally, would you pair it with food, cheese, chocolate? Um, how would you approach it in that
I
sense?
mean, I would say yes to all the above. We tell people we ultimately we don't really care how you consume your whiskey or our whiskey, just as long as you consume it. But I would say, kind of my general rule is with any whiskey, whether it's Sleeper's Fork or whatever, is always try something neat. I want to know that spirit before I figure out what I'm going to do with it, if that makes sense. So to me, I mean, I encourage people to try our whiskey neat, and in our tasting room, we ask when tours come through, who here regularly drinks neat whiskey, and out of 25 folks on a tour, maybe maybe four or five will raise their hand, which is pretty telling. So, but I do encourage people to try their whiskey and Leaper Sport neat, just to kind of get to know the spirit, and then say, hey, that may pair well with this, or that may be. And pairing dinners when it comes to whiskey, I don't know about the UK, but they've become kind of a big thing here in the States. So we do a lot of that. I think neat whiskey pairs well with a lot of food. So we actually do pairing dinners at the distillery from time to time.
No, nice. Yeah, no, it's definitely a growing thing here. I mean, the kind of cheese and chocolate's been around for a while, but you do see a lot more brands doing kind of high-end tastings where it's like a seven-course meal paired with seven different whiskeys, and yeah, definitely it's
And desserts are wonderful. We actually used to give little chocolates during our tasting, and after when we tell them drink half your whiskey and then try to pair it with this chocolate, and it's amazing how dessert complements whiskey, whether that's Scotch Irish or bourbon.
yeah.
It's pretty amazing. Yeah.
No, it definitely is. So now on to the big three questions. So your music or playlist, if you're sitting down to crack open a bottle of Leaper's Fork, what are you listening to, or what do you recommend people listen to?
I mean, it sounds cliche, but I'll probably have to go with Chris Stapleton, and I'll tell you why. Obviously he wrote the Tennessee. He didn't write it. He covered the most famous version of Tennessee whiskey. He's actually lives down the road from the distillery, and his brother-in-law is a friend of mine and works for us at the distillery as well. So I would say Chris Stapleton. And a matter of fact, Milroy's in London. Uh, um, the head bartender there created a cocktail with our Tennessee whiskey called the Neighbor Down the Road, and it's a little tip of the hat to Chris. So I would say that.
Brilliant. No, that's a great answer. If the music rights will allow it, I'll try and insert some in here. The and your favorite whiskey outside of the Leaper's Fork range, what's your go-to dram of any genre?
I mean, this is going to sound like pandering, but I promise you it's not. So, like, if I'm at a restaurant, if I'm not consuming my own whiskey, and of course, I appreciate all different kinds of whiskey. That's the reason I got in. I'm a consumer as well, and I rarely find anything like people. I try to find things, the good things in whiskey. So But at the so I rarely meet a whiskey that I don't like. But if I'm somewhere at a restaurant where they don't have my whiskey, or I'm trying to find something new, I would say it's usually a single malt Scotch. I mean, Glenfarclas is a brand that I really like, and I've spent some time at that distillery over in Speyside, or an Irish or single malt. Usually it's some type of single malt, but I do like some of our folks here, and I like trying the new things coming out of American distilleries, because there's this renaissance. It's provided a different a different palette for American whiskey people to um, to experience. So it's been fun, but I can't necessarily say I'm a brand guy, so to
No,
speak.
fair enough. No, that's a good and comprehensive answer. Can't argue with that. Now you obviously you mentioned at the start, or much earlier on in this conversation, about your youthful history distilling as probably about 7 years old when you started home distillation.
No, no, no.
But what's your first memory of drinking whiskey, or being sort of introduced to whiskey in a meaningful
I
way?
mean, I would say probably like any good Southerner. My introduction to whiskey probably started as a Jack Daniels and Coke, probably around you know 15 or 16 years old, which is early.
Hmm.
I'm telling a lot on myself, but that tends to be in when I was at university. When you're at a football game, everybody's drinking Jack and Coke or Makers and Coke, so it would be one of those. And my dad he drank Old Forester, which is obviously a very well known bourbon. So I remember as a younger kid, sneaking a little sip of that, and and obviously knocked me on my ass. I wasn't expected the assault on the senses that whiskey can be in its neat form, but yeah, I would say that.
No, well, a mixed drink is a good and an honest answer, because it is the passage the pathway most people go through getting into consuming whiskey, be it Jack and Coke, Jameson Ginger, kind of a whiskey soda, these, or just an old fashioned or whiskey sour. It's a good entryway. I mean, not everyone has to come out the womb drinking 25-year-old Macallan or something.
I would be worried about someone if they did.
No, that's very true. Definitely. Listen, Lee, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on, and meeting you for the second time since our digital dram tasting. So hopefully, third time will be in person. But really appreciate your time, and will have said this in the intro, recorded separately. But please, anyone who's in a whiskey shop or on our website, it's worth picking up a bottle of this. At the moment, our W Club Premium tier members get 10% discount on this dram, and it's worth it. It's a stunning whiskey, and it's W Club member approved in that regard. So yeah, congratulations on your excellent whiskey, and thank you for your time.
Well, thank you, Luke. I look forward to seeing you in the UK. I'll keep you posted on when we're over next, and would love to grab a dram with you. So thank you.
Brilliant, excellent.